Okay, hello. So I am once again the CSS person at a JavaScript conference, and I'm going to try not to wander away from this microphone. So, yeah, this is me, and some of the places you'll find me. In the context of this talk, probably the most important thing is that I am a CSS working group invited expert, which means that I kind of help to make CSS, although you can't blame me for all of it. And if you've seen anything that I've done in the past or know anything about me, you'll know that I've spent quite a lot of time talking about a CSS specification called Grid Layout. In fact, I talked about it for so long before it was actually in browsers that people were starting to accuse me of talking about CSS vaporware. And then in March this year, I was very pleased because this happened, and we got CSS Grid Layout in all of those browsers, and the updated implementation will ship in Edge next week. So I'm kind of pleased about that, you know. But I've been going around talking about Grid, and now, of course, Grid is actually in browsers. People are starting to use it. And it's a pretty big specification. There's an awful lot to it. And in this talk, what I really wanted to do was just look at some of the kind of big questions that people have about the specification and just talk about some of those and answer some of those questions. And so those are really, you know, what is Grid? Why is it different to Flexbox? How do I actually get started using this thing in production? What am I going to do about old browsers? And also, just touch on, well, how do we get something like Grid into browsers? How do we encourage browsers to give us shiny new things? So let's start with the first of those, and that is, you know, why don't you just use Flexbox? We've got that, and we know how to use it now. So why have the CSS working group gone and created a new layout method? And there's also this kind of strange assumption from people that Grid and Flexbox are competing layout methods, as if the CSS working group are planning some kind of CSS specification deathmatch, which will win. We're not. So Flexbox is for one-dimensional layout. That's if you want to lay something out as a row or as a column, not both at once. And this is what I mean by that. This is a Flexbox example. So we've got a bunch of things, they're laid out with Flexbox, and we let them wrap. And if there is not the same amount of things on the last row as on all the other rows, then it kind of spreads out. Space distribution happens row by row, or if you're working in columns, column by column. It's not so easy to get the things at the last row to line up with the stuff above them. Because if you want to do that, you want two-dimensional layout, which is what you have with CSS Grid. So this is the same layout, but using Grid. So you've got flexible columns, and you've got rows, and things line up in both rows and columns at the same time. That's two-dimensional. And to create that layout, this is what we have to apply to the container. So we're using the repeat syntax, we're auto-filling columns that are a minimum of 200 pixels, and the extra is shared out between all of the columns. And you might be thinking, well, I can do that with Flexbox, I just need to give widths, percentage widths, to my columns. And that's exactly the point at which you need to say, I need Grid. If you're adding widths to all of your Flex items, you probably need Grid at that point. That's probably why you're doing that. So another way to look at this is that Flexbox works from the content out and Grid works layout in most of the time. So if you've got a collection of things which could be different sizes and you just want to say, well, all be in a row and just spread yourself out and have equal space between them, that is a really good Flexbox thing. So we have this list here and we just want the spaces between the items to be the same. You might want these items to grow and shrink from a flex basis of auto, and each line become a new flex container. You might want that. You might want that spreading out thing on the last line. And so you end up with this kind of thing. Again, these things aren't lined up in a grid. They're using the content as their size, and they're just sort of sorting themselves out so they all fit in. With Grid, you say, here is my grid. This is the size of those tracks, and the items go into those tracks. They're constrained by the tracks most of the time. So here I'm creating a 4-column track grid with the FR unit, which says, you know, it's the available space you've got, we're going to split into 4, and we're going to share that out evenly. And so we'd get this, and we don't need to add anything to the items. It's just happening on the grid container. The nice thing about that FR unit is because we're distributing available space, we can have proportions. So here I'm saying we're going to have a 2FR track, then a 1FR, then a 2FR, then a 1FR, and that gives us something like this. Again, we're not adding stuff to the items, we're doing that on the grid container when we define the grid. We can actually let content define track size, and we've even got new keywords we can use to do that, but then it defines the entire track. So here I'm using min content for the first track, and that's basically, in the context of grid, says be as small as you can be if you take advantage of all of the soft wrapping opportunities. And then we've got max content, which says be as big as you can be and don't take any soft wrapping opportunities. And then we have fit content, which basically says act like max content until you get to the size I've specified. In this case, that's 200 pixels, and then stop. And what that gives us is something like this. So each of those tracks is defined by the content in the first cell, the first row. We've sort of set some sizing. So whichever is the biggest thing in that first track, the longest word is going to define the size of that min content track. It's going to wrap as much as it can. So if we had a longer word, if we put, I don't know, aubergine in the second track there, that would be the longest word, and that would change the track size. The middle track with max content is getting as long as that top line. And then the other one is using fit content, and that is going to 200 pixels because there's more content in there. But the thing to sort of remember is that other layout methods start with the item. And I think that's why people are confused sometimes with grid, because they're very used to creating layout by putting widths on items and making them all line up. So if we have a float grid, that's exactly what we do. We say, well, I need to float this thing, I need to give it a width, and then all the other things will have a width too, and so they'll sit next to it, it'll look like I've got a grid. We do the same with inline block. We say display inline block, we give it a width. And even with Flexbox, although we say display flex on the parent, if we want to create a grid type layout with Flexbox, again, we have to go back and put sizing on the item itself. Usually by setting the flex basis. So grid is different. Here we do all of our grid creation on the parent, and the only other layout method that does anything close to that is multiple column layout. So grid is all about containers. And once you know this, the decision of whether to use grid or Flexbox becomes a lot easier. There isn't a right or wrong. It depends on the sort of thing you're trying to lay out. You'll probably use both in most designs. And so we want to start using grid in production because it's new and it's shiny and it solves problems that we can't solve easily. So let's have a look at some worked examples. These are some examples that I was messing around with for the redesign of my own site. It's always a good place to start if you're going to be playing around with something new in production. And my site is mostly listings of things, so talks I've given and so on, podcasts and books. And so I've got lots of little boxes, and I wanted to sort of create this kind of layout. And I was working in a pattern library, putting all this together and trying out different kinds of boxes. So I was looking at this item here. Now, here I've got an item which has got a heading, and it's got some content, and then there's an image behind that. So I want to put the content on top of the image. So we can end up with this sort of thing. I can put some sort of images behind there. And so I've got a wrapper, I've given it a class of box feature, and inside the direct children of that wrapper are the image, the title, and the content. So that's the container. That box feature is the container. We turn on grid, saying display grid. All of the direct children now become grid items. Grid gap creates a gap between the tracks. And then I'm going to define some column tracks here. So I'm using repeat. I'm saying repeat 6 times 1FR. That'll give me 6 1FR sized columns. And this FR unit, as I say, it defines a fraction of the available space in the grid container, as we saw earlier. So we're going to get roughly 6 equal width columns, but until we do something, they're not quite equal width. And that's because we're distributing available space. So that second track is actually being pushed wider by the word featured. It's worth remembering that the FR unit behaves like that. It's not actually saying equal width columns. it's going to size of what the available space is. And in this case, it's a bit less available space because we've got one word that's too big. And those tracks you can see on there are highlighted using the Firefox Grid Inspector. If you're doing any grid layout, you want to use Firefox. The developer tools in Firefox are excellent. So I'm then going to start positioning things on that box. So I'm stretching the image right across the box from column line 1 to column line -1, so the first to the last column line, and then stretching it from row line 1 to row line 4. Something that is worth pointing out, in English, obviously line 1 is on the left, the lines count up from there, -1 is on the right. If we were working in Arabic or any other right-to-left language, line 1 would be on the right-hand side of the grid. New layout methods respect the writing mode of the document. And also, we're seeing an example here of the explicit grid, which is what you define with grid template columns and grid template rows, and the implicit grid. In this case, I'm creating row tracks by placing that image from rows 1 to 4. I've not defined rows 1 to 4, but I'm actually using those lines. And grid will just create lines. If you place things outside of the grid, you have content that flows outside of the grid, you'll get an implicit grid. Grid will actually create you some tracks. And so you can see here, this is the image. We've got the tracks there overlaid by the Firefox Grid Inspector. And I can then put the content, the title and the text content, I can position that over the image because grid lets us layer things up. And we get this. Again, I'm still highlighting the tracks so you can see where they are. And you can see how that second auto-generated track is growing to allow the content to expand as big as it will be. So as I mentioned, you can layer stuff up on the grid, so you can position things into the same grid cells. As you'd kind of expect, items further down in the source will appear on top, but you can control that stack using Z-index exactly the same way as you would if you had things that were positioned. So this little item shows us a whole bunch of the features of grid layout. We've used FR units, we've used repeat notation. You've seen how grid auto-places items that haven't been positioned. When we first set up our tracks, things just ended up in the tracks. We've covered the implicit and explicit grid. You've seen line-based positioning. You know that grid respects writing mode. We've used some of the box alignment properties that you might already know from Flexbox. That is quite a lot for a little box. Now, the other things in the listing are actually pretty simple. They'll just lay themselves out using auto-placement. But all of the items now sit in an overall grid layout. And I want to use auto-placement for that because I never know how many things I'm going to have. This stuff comes out of the CMS. Some things are going to have lots of boxes, some are only going to have a few. I'd also like to create a few rules around auto-placement. So this time I'm going to create a 12-column flexible grid. So I've now got 12 columns for the overall grid for my page. And this is where I want to get to. So again, using the Firefox Grid Inspector, I can see the tracks of the grid. I want it laid out like this. But if I just create a grid with that content inside it, including my feature item that I've just created, I'm going to end up with this. And that's auto-placement at work. Because I've got 12 column tracks, grid is just placing each item into a column track, because that's what it does. All the direct children become grid items. They all get stuck into a cell of the grid. So the first thing I want to do is position the title and the main content there. So I'm just using line-based positioning. So I'm positioning the title on the left and then the main content on the right. So we're getting somewhere. We've got the top two items looking as we want them, but auto-placement's carrying on with the rest of the boxes and just laying them out, stuffing them into those column tracks. So I want to keep that auto-placement. That's pretty useful, just being able to chuck a bunch of content at a grid and lay it out. But I want to ask those items to span a few tracks. So we can do that. We can do that in a couple of ways. Using the shorthand grid column, I can say auto, so start on the line you expect to start on, the next sort of free line, and span 4 tracks. That will work. Or I could just set the end. So I could say grid row end, span 2 for the smaller boxes, the sort of media ones that I want to have taller. So you can do it in either way, because the start line will be auto if you don't specify it. So you can actually specify it, or you can just specify the end line. That's fine. And I'm doing the same for smaller boxes there, just spanning 3 tracks, which gives us this. which is pretty nice. So basically, AutoPlacement, it will position anything that you've given an explicit position to with line-based positioning, and then it will, with everything else, it will just find a gap for it, and by default will keep it in source order. So it will just start on the next line it can and span as many lines as you ask it to. And I've been showing you the rules there for the widest breakpoint, so my desktop layout. And the nice thing with Grid is because your layout is defined in CSS, you can make changes very easily for different breakpoints. You can just redefine things right there in the CSS. And you can do that one of two ways. You could redefine your grid containers, you could change how many tracks you've got, or you could keep the same number of tracks and just mess around with how many tracks things took up. So as the tracks got smaller, you'd probably want things to take up more tracks. And that's what I'm going to do here. So for very narrow screens, I want my title to span right across, and then as I get more screen real estate, I'm just going to change how that is placed. So we're just redefining how many columns it takes up. And we can do the same with the autoplay stuff. At narrow breakpoints, the boxes span 6 tracks, dropping to 4. So we've kept our 12-column grid, as you can see there, again with the grid inspector creating those lines. The columns are just narrower on smaller screens, so to keep things readable, we span more columns. And that's very similar to the way that things like Bootstrap and Foundation work, when you have your sort of different classes for different sizes, different breakpoints, and then it will span different numbers of tracks. So that's all really nice and shiny and exciting, and we can do all sorts of cool things, but what about old browsers? That image, I was doing a triathlon, I was locking my bike up, and I turned around, and there it was, the old IE roller. It's like being trolled out in the real world. It's amazing. But yeah, it's going to make it onto many a slide. But, you know, the reality of old browsers, they're not going to go away overnight, and we're never going to be in a situation where, you know, the CSS working group creates something marvelous, and then suddenly there it all is in everybody's browser all over the world. It doesn't work like that. The thing with new CSS is that defined into the specification is how to deal with old browsers, how Grid and how Flexbox actually deal with older layout methods and kind of coming up against them is defined there. And that means that you can actually overwrite older stuff with newer stuff sort of very elegantly. So it's all defined in the spec. So once a parent element becomes a grid container or a flex container, a lot of the other methods just kind of stop applying. So that means that if you've got, you know, a child element which is floated and it then becomes a grid item, it just stops behaving like a floated item. So you don't have to do anything. You can just overwrite that behavior. And what this means is if you're careful, you don't need to build 2 layouts. You really can just enhance stuff with newer layout methods, and Grid works really well at that. So as a quick example, here's our listing page in a browser that doesn't support Grid Layout. Now, as you'd expect, everything is displaying just in document flow because it's not got any layout. It's just been laid out one thing after the other. Now, in this case, perhaps I'm going to use Flexbox as a fallback. So I've chosen FlexLayout as my fallback, and I know that flex items will become grid items if grid is supported, and the sort of flex properties that you apply to the item, they'll just go away. They'll just be chucked away once it becomes a grid item. The thing is, though, I've then added this sort of margin on my flex items because we don't have anything like grid gap for Flexbox yet. It has been defined in the spec that we will get something like the grid gap property for Flexbox in the future. So I want to remove that margin because the grid items are also going to see that. And for that, I'm going to use something else that's defined in CSS to help us with this stuff, and that is feature queries. Feature queries really will become your new best friend. They're just like media queries. Instead of checking for screen size, you're checking to see if the browser supports the thing you want to use, and they have really good support. And it doesn't matter the fact that IE11 doesn't support feature queries, because what you do with feature queries is you write your old CSS, then you ask the browser if it supports the new thing, and then you do the new thing. And so old browsers do the old thing, they don't understand the new thing, so they don't do it. New browsers understand the new thing, and so can overwrite anything that happens for the old thing, like this. So we don't need to remove the flex properties. They're ignored anyway when the flex item becomes a grid item. That's defined in the spec. You just need to override things that would make a difference to the layout. So here I'm saying at support display grid. Hey browser, do you support display grid? The browser says, yep. So right, remove that margin, please. And that's it. So inside your feature query, you just do whatever it is you want to do for the new browser. In reality, what I tend to find I've got inside my feature queries is a bunch of widths being set back to auto, because if you're doing floats as a fallback or inline blocks as a fallback, you're probably going to need to put a width on things. And then, yeah, knocking off margins and so on. If you want to really go all in with a fallback layout, you might have more stuff to overwrite, but a lot of the time you don't have to do very much. So this starts to get there. It's giving me this using the flex layout instead of the grid layout. And I can just give the feature box there, a larger flex basis in order to get somewhere close to what I have with my grid layout. And so in this case, the flex version alongside the grid version, what we don't get with Flexbox is the nice layering up of items. You can't really do that. You could probably fake that with absolute positioning. It gets a bit fragile when you start to use absolute positioning for that sort of thing. I probably wouldn't bother. But you could do. You could go further with this stuff. But it shows you can kind of create a simpler layout and then use grid for the things that grid does really well on top of that, and an awful lot of people are going to get the grid version. So just to quickly run through those fallback methods, float and clear have no effect on a grid item. So if something is floated, becomes a grid item, it stops having any floaty type behavior assigned to it. Inline block, you get the weird thing where you have the extra white space with inline block items. Once it becomes a grid item, it's no longer inline, so that stuff goes away. If you use display TableCell, if you need to support really old IEs, TableCell is a really useful way of kind of having some sort of thing a bit like your grid layout. Things stop behaving like table elements. Importantly, the anonymous boxes for the table row and the table wrapper don't happen if things become a grid item. If you are using inline block or TableCell, you may well want to use the vertical align property. That's kind of why we use those things for layout. And again, it is just thrown away once then becomes a grid or a flex item. You can even use multiple column layout as a fallback. Don't forget about it. It will lay things out in columns rather than across the row. But if you've got some kind of card-based layout, often MultiColumn will help you do that and make you something a bit like a grid layout. Certainly worth looking at as a fallback. And then a lot of the time, FlexLayout, if you're only having to deal with, say, IE11 and up or whatever, FlexLayout may be a decent fallback for you. And as I mentioned, mostly in practice, unless you're trying to build, almost the same layout for older browsers, and that's probably not such a great thing to do. If you really have that many users of older browsers, maybe it's too early for you to use grid. That's okay. In practice, you probably just need to override widths and margins. The width issue is kind of important to know about. So here we've got a floated layout. If I've got an item set to float left and width 33.33%, that's going to be 33% of the container. The minute that becomes a grid item in a grid layout, if we've got 3 column tracks, it's going to become 33% of the track it's in. That's not what you want. So that's why you'd want to set your width back to auto in that case. And there is a cheat sheet to help, and it sort of goes through all of those things. So what of Edge and IE? Now, before anyone starts Microsoft bashing, we only have grid layout because the IE team developed the specification and put it in IE 10. This spec in its sort of modern form came from the IE team initially, which means there is an older version of grid layout in IE 10 and 11. It doesn't have all of the things that modern grid layout now has, because the spec has moved on. It was done many years ago. But it is actually quite solid and quite usable. So you can actually use old grid as a fallback for new grid in IE 10 and 11. What's going into Edge next week is going to be the modern grid layout. So older versions of Edge have this older spec, which is MS prefixed. IE 10 and 11 have the older spec, MS prefixed. There's no auto placement, there's no grid template areas, But for simple line-based positioning, the syntax is a bit different, but it works. And I've written some stuff about how you can use that. There's a few examples of mine floating around for when I was originally playing around with that as well. It's worth noting that Autoprefixer is disabled by default. It can add MS Grid prefixes. This is not usually what you want because the two things are completely different. Generally, Autoprefixer will just mash up your layout for you. I probably wouldn't use it. So let's just go back to this slide. All of those browsers supporting Grid pretty much at the same time, other than Edge, and they waited till everything had shipped before they updated. So how does this sort of thing happen? And why hasn't a browser implemented a favorite feature of yours? Partly it's because every browser is essentially a business, so they have business decisions to make. But regular developers have more influence over this process than you would think. It is really important for you to let browser vendors know which features that you want. They're looking for this stuff. They're actually looking, on the web to find out what information, what features people are after. Some browsers have somewhere you can actually go and vote for things. This is the Edge user voice. There are features there. You can go and vote for them. Grid Layout was there for a long time, and people were saying, hey, update Grid, and getting lots and lots of votes there. So you can actually go and ask for things. So people asking for a feature helps the engineers who work on this stuff to be able to make a case to their bosses that the web community would like something. They're also looking at this stuff. What are you using? Even if things aren't implemented everywhere, if you're using it on a site, that is noticed. This is the Microsoft CSS Usage on the web platform. Which properties are actually being used. If you can use some stuff on personal sites that you really like, that's actually going to add to that data saying, people are wanting to use this thing, so let's implement it in our browser. And just on that note, here's something that I would really like to see implemented, so I keep showing it to people in the hope that other people will talk about it too. This is CSS Exclusions. As you can see, the text there wraps all the way around that image. It was part of the CSS shape spec and was removed into its own spec. It means you can basically position something and wrap text all the way round. It is only in IE and Edge. Makes a huge amount of sense alongside Grid Layout because you could position something using Grid and then say, right, the rest of the content just flow around it. It's basically this little property of wrap flow. Chrome platform status says there's no public signals. I'd really like to change that because I think it's a useful thing. So if you find these sort of things and you like them, talk about them, write about them, use them on your site. Tell your friends, or the ones that are web developers anyway. Do push forward your pet features because anyone can get involved in the future of CSS. And you don't need to be part of the CSS working group. You can actually get involved with what we're doing there. All of our stuff is on a CSS working group draft repository on GitHub, and you can raise issues against CSS specs just like you can any other open source project, and we will discuss them in our meetings. And so if you've got a problem with an existing spec, or you think there should be something new added to Grid or anything else, come and tell us or comment on existing issues. We bring this stuff up all the time. We're always trying to find out what web developers actually think. So here's one of the issues. People would like to be able to style the grid cells, so be able to put backgrounds and borders on them. That's been discussed there on GitHub. How could we do this? What would that look like? What use cases have people got for it? So it's really important. You can go along, you can comment on the issues that are already there, you can raise new issues. Also, raise bugs against browsers, vote on features if you can, write about them. But remember to be nice while doing it. Generally, the engineers would quite like to do this stuff as well, but they've got to make a case to their boss. There's lots of browser engineers out there on Twitter and things, and they're usually really happy to chat to people. So, talk about what you'd like, because we can all make the platform better. So anyway, I'm very, very happy that CSS Grid turned up. I'm looking forward to the future of what we can do with the Grid spec. And do have a look. Make sure you check your analytics and find out how many people of your site have got Grid support. I'm seeing anything from about 75% to about 95% on some of my sites. So do have a look. It's very, very quickly rolling out to people. And you may well find you can start using it more than you think. And I made you a bunch of resources, and these slides we publish and things. You can have a look at those. And as mentioned, my new book was out this week, New CSS Layout, all about how grid fits into the overall sort of thing of layout and the different methods we've got. If you like this sort of stuff, you might find that useful. And you will find my slides and all of the code that I showed today at that URL. Thank you very much for listening.